you everyone for joining us for our webinar today about the E-2 visa. Today we're going to be looking at a unique aspect of the E-2 visa, specifically those applications that we would refer to as particularly risky. And usually what we mean by that is a low investment amount. But we'll also be looking at some specific categories of E-2 visas, some specific business types of businesses that can also be challenging. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga. I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC, and we are very fortunate to have the founder of our firm, Ian Scott, to be joining us for today's webinar. Ian will be specifically talking about those uniquely risky categories of E-2 visas, as well as some recent trends that we've been seeing in the E-2 visa application space. Some of you may know that Ian has personally navigated a number of non-immigrant visas, including the F1, the TN, and the E-2. He actually started our law firm on an E-2 visa, and his investment amount, had he been a client of our firm, I think we would have definitely told him he had a relatively risky case because he had a low investment amount. So his experience personally navigating that process really does inform the way that we work with our clients. A few things to touch on before we get started. Our firm is a full-service immigration firm, so though we do focus on business immigration, we handle the full spectrum of immigration cases, including family immigration cases, humanitarian immigration cases, whatever it is involving U.S. immigration law. We would be happy to help. So we do hope you reach out to us if we can be helpful in any way. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a month, and at this point I think we're doing 2 a week at least. And these cover a range of immigration topics. So after this presentation, we'll send you a link where you can sign up for those future webinars. The other thing to know is that we will be recording this webinar. We post our recorded webinars, the full-length webinars, on our YouTube channel, as well as shorter videos. And those videos also touch on a range of topics. We really do try to put free information that is extremely high quality out there for you all. So do check out our YouTube channel, do check out our blog on our website. We'll send links to both of those in the email that you'll get after this presentation. That email will also have the PowerPoint that you see on your screen, as well as a comprehensive guide to the E-2 visa. And that is just a compilation of what we've found to be the most valuable guidance if you are trying to get a sense of how to apply and some helpful tips. So if you do have a question during the presentation, please do send it in through either the Q&A box on Zoom or the chat box on Zoom. We will be actively monitoring those, and we'll either answer the question as it comes in or we'll save it for the end of the presentation. But either way, we do plan to get through all the questions by the end, so do send in those questions. Without further ado, I will go ahead and dive in by talking about the E-2 visa requirements. Now, the name of the E-2 visa is the E-2 Treaty Investor Visa, and what it means to be a treaty investor visa is that you do need to have a passport from one of the dozens of E-2 treaty countries. So to figure out if you have such a passport, you would go to the US Department of State website. You can Google DOS E-2 treaty countries, and you'll get a list. And literally, I believe at this point there are over 80 E-2 treaty countries, and they really do span the globe. So odds are that you do have a passport from an E-2 treaty country. However, a number of countries are not on the list, and those include Brazil, India, China. There is an option to get E-2 treaty country citizenship through investment if you are from one of those countries that is not an E-2 treaty country, but that's outside the scope of this presentation. Do reach out to us if you're interested in that option. But one final point on this nationality requirement I'm talking about is that you only need a passport from the E-2 treaty country. You do not actually need to have been born in an E2 treaty country. So even if, say, you have a parent, to give an example, if you are from Uruguay, born and raised, lived your whole life in Uruguay, or Uruguay is not an E2 treaty country, but you have a parent who's from Italy, and so you have Italian citizenship through a parent. Italy is an E2 treaty country. Even if you've never been to Italy, you've spent your whole life in Uruguay, you would still be eligible to apply for an E2 visa on your Italian passport. The second requirement you see on your screen is that you must own at least 50% of the E2 company. Now, this is a hard and strict requirement. Your ownership share cannot drop below 50%. The moment it does, you become ineligible. If you're already on an E2 visa, you lose your eligibility. And if you're applying for an E2 visa and you have 49% ownership, you'll be denied. You need that 50%. Now, what that means, though, is that you can have another 50% owner. You can have two E2 investors tied to the same E2 company if you are both from an E2 treaty country. You can even have a co-investor with 50% ownership who's from a different E2 treaty country. So let's say one owner is from Italy, one owner is from Germany. That E2 treaty country would have dual nationality, and that's important because you can actually hire and employ people with passports from either of those two countries to come to the US on E2 employee visas. And of course, they would need to meet separate requirements to qualify for that, but they would meet the nationality requirement by having that passport. If your co-owner, say you have a 50%, say you own 50% of the company, the other co-owner who owns the remaining 50% really could be anyone. It doesn't have to be an E2 treaty country national. It could be a US citizen. It could be a US permanent resident. It could be 100 other people who own that remaining 50%. The important thing is that you, as the E2 treaty investor applicant, own at least 50%. The third requirement you see on your screen is that you must make an investment. Now, to make an investment means that the funds are not simply transferred to a business bank account. Those funds actually need to be what's called at risk, meaning spent. So what we typically recommend is that you earn funds from whatever source, as long as it's legal and legitimate, and the government will ask where the funds came from. You do need to document that. But the government's very accepting of a variety of sources. So as long as the source of funds is legal, and as long as it is not a loan secured by the E2 company, then generally speaking, it's an acceptable source of funds. So that means it could be a personal loan to you, it could be a gift to you from really anyone, as long as you can document where the funds came from. To the person who gave you the funds, they need to show where they got the funds. It could be the sale of an apartment, it could be earned income from work. So once you have those funds that you've planned to invest in the company, we would typically recommend that you transfer those to the business bank account and then actually spend those. Now, how much do you need to spend? Very common question. It is a key topic of this presentation. You'll want to invest a substantial amount. That's a word that the government uses. A substantial amount depends on the type of business, but it's really what is needed to get the business operating. So think about, what does the business need so that once I get this visa, I can hit the ground running in the US and start actually operating the business. So typically that would be getting an office space, marketing, paying for office supplies, computers, getting any insurance you need, any business permits, maybe hiring an independent contractor or an employee. But you'd want to spend the money on all those things before you apply for the visa. And you see some examples on your screen of some typical E2 expenditures. We'll talk more about that. The fourth requirement is that the business cannot be marginal. That's a word you don't hear a lot. What the government means when they say that is that the business needs to generate enough money to financially support both the E2 investor and their family and the employees. Now, the business does have to have employees. It does not have to have employees before you apply, but within a 5-year time frame, you should expect to have at least 3 full-time equivalent US workers. And that is what we refer to as the marginality requirement. That employment figure really is a make or break requirement. So by having employees, you can strengthen an application that's otherwise weak. Say, for example, your investment amount is low. Or conversely, by not having employees and not convincing the government that you will have employees, you can really weaken an application and get a denial. So that employment requirement really, like I said, can make an application or can break an application. The fifth requirement is the business must be real and operating. Now, that's related to a requirement I said before, the requirement that you actually spend the funds. So the business needs to be ready to operate by the time you get the visa. So imagine you're in that interview at the consulate and the officer says to you, all right, if I give you this visa, are you going to be ready to buy your flight, show up in the US and hit the ground running, start generating revenue? You need to be able to say yes. You have everything lined up, insurance, permits, an office space, any workers you need. Get those lined up before you head into that consular interview. Now, ways you can show that. You would want to include in your application a signed lease for office space, proof that the business has been established. So usually that's an LLC, a limited liability company that could be started really in any state in the US, generally the state where you will be operating. Show that you have a website created, that you're already marketing the services. If you're in the US and you cannot work, have a website that says coming soon, we'll be operating soon, that's fine. Show that you have letters of interest from prospective customers or contracts that have been executed with customers. And as I mentioned, any licenses that you need have been secured. If you're starting a restaurant, you'll want to make sure you have a permit from the health department saying that you can sell food. If you're starting a bar, you need to have a license to sell alcohol, or if you're selling alcohol at a convenience store, have that license showing that you can sell that. So examples of what the government is going to want to see before you actually show up for your interview. The sixth requirement you see is that you need to be coming to the US solely to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. Now, that has a couple aspects to it. First is you need to be qualified to run the business. Usually that's a very low requirement. We would include a resume with the application, but really it's an opportunity to advocate for yourself. So, look at your resume and really cater it to to highlight your strengths. And really emphasize that given the experience that you do have, you're well equipped to run the business. So just as an example, we have many clients who have started convenience stores. Typically, those clients will not have experience running a convenience store in the past. They might have experience being a teacher, operating a classroom, they might have experience performing other management functions, maybe at a retail store, a clothing store. So use your experience to your advantage and really advocate for yourself. The other aspect of that requirement is that your work authorization in the US is limited to the E-2 company. So you cannot come to the US on an E-2 visa and then start working for a different company. Even if you're doing your own company at the same time, your work authorization is limited to the E-2 company. So that is very important as well. And finally, the seventh requirement, you need to intend to return to your home country at the end of your E-2 status. The E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. It is not a green card. It does not automatically lead to a green card. Although if the opportunity presents itself, you can apply for a green card while you're on an E-2. But in your E-2 application, you want to make it clear to the officer that your intention is not to stay in the US permanently, that your intention is to return to your home country. Now, that being said, you can renew the E-2 visa indefinitely as long as you remain eligible. There's no limit to how long you can renew it. You just want to be prepared to show that you still do have ties to your home country. So we already touched on a number of the bullets you see on your screen now, but let's talk a little bit more about who can apply for an E-2 visa and how long the E-2 visa lasts. As I mentioned before, the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. It allows nationals of E-2 treaty countries to come to the US to develop and direct the operations of a business in which they've invested. And in that single sentence, that first bullet, you see a number of requirements there. The investment requirement, the real and operating requirement, the nationality requirement, all of these we talked about on the prior slide. There are a number of options to get an E-2 visa. Many of our clients have started their own company, so they're applying with a startup. And since the topic of this presentation is risky E-2 applications, oftentimes that will mean a startup. The reason that these can be riskier is that oftentimes you can apply with a relatively low amount of money. We'll talk about how much investment is enough on the next slide. But a startup, for example, a law firm, and Ian can speak to this from his personal experience. A law firm doesn't require a lot of money to get started. You need a computer, a small office space, a couple subscriptions, insurance, and you might find yourself having spent $15,000 or $20,000 and saying, "I've spent everything I need for this business." While we would say invest more than $15,000 or $20,000, a startup oftentimes doesn't require a lot of money. But startups can be a very viable path to an E-2 visa. So one thing you can do as well if you're applying with a startup is to include a business plan. And that is really key. We'll talk about that more in this presentation, but that is how you can get an E-2 visa without having employed anyone yet. A business plan, a good business plan, will convince the government that in the next few years you will employ people. So option one to apply for an E-2 visa is to apply with a startup. Option two is to apply with an existing business. Now, what I mean by that is you can buy a business that has been operational in the US. Either that's usually through a business broker who sells such businesses, or maybe you know someone who is selling a business. It could be a family member, it could be a friend who has a business that they're looking to sell. Just some examples: we've had clients who have purchased convenience stores that have operated for years, and then the owner wants to retire. So our client purchased 50% or 100% of that business. Could be a restaurant. It could be any number of businesses. A school, that's another example we had. Again, you'll want to apply with you'll want to own at least 50% of the existing business. And ideally, you'll want to make sure that the business you're buying has employed workers in the past, because if it hasn't, you have to explain that track record and explain to the government and kind of convince them that you're going to do something different that will result in employment, even though the business has not employed people in the past. So if you're looking to buy, do buy a business that has been employing people. And the third option, which is not on your screen, but is very common, is a franchise. You can start a franchise. I would say that is a less risky option. And the reason for that is franchises tend to be more recognizable to government officials. They tend to have a track record that you can point to. You're getting support from a franchisor that's done this in the past in other states. So odds are you'll be able to use that resource and the franchisor's support to make a successful business that will employ people. So starting a franchise is another very viable option to pursue an E-2 visa. Now, I already talked about this third bullet. There must be a treaty between the US and the foreign country. You only need a passport from that foreign country. You don't need to have been born there or even to have lived there. And the E-2 visa is valid for anywhere from 3 months to 5 years. The amount of time depends on the passport that you are applying for the visa on. So if you are a dual citizen of Germany and Italy, and you decide to apply in Frankfurt on your German passport, your validity period is going to be dependent on your German citizenship. To figure out how long the visa can be issued for, you would Google DOS, Department of State, reciprocity. And you will see a list of countries, and you'll be able to click on one and click the E-2 visa type, and you'll see how many months or years the E-2 visa can be issued for. Many of our clients are issued 5-year visas. Now, Canada gets a 5-year visa, for example, Canadians. Now, one thing is that the government officers do have the discretion to issue the visa for a shorter period of time. They usually don't do that, but for example, if you are applying with a startup idea, for example, that they think is tenuous, that maybe has a low likelihood of success, they might say, we'll give you the visa for 3 years, come back, apply again. We want to see how the business is doing. They might do that. They have that discretion. It's not common though. And the last point I'll make about visa validity is regardless of whether you're given a visa for 3 months or 5 years, the visa is only a document that allows you to ask for entry into the United States. Once the government allows you to enter at an airport, or for example, or at a land crossing, they will give you a period of stay. And that period of stay, regardless of the length of your visa, is usually 2 years. So even, let's take an extreme example. If you're given a 3-month E-2 visa, Bangladesh is a country that has a 3-month validity period. Say you're from Bangladesh, you get an E-2 visa for 3 months. You come in on day one of your visa validity. You'll be given typically 2 years of status in the US. So the moment you leave the US, you either need to have a valid visa to re-enter, or if your visa's expired, that's when you'll need to go back to the consulate and renew your visa. But let's say you stay in the US for 2 years, presumably you would only need to go back to Bangladesh to renew your visa 2 years down the road, not every 3 months. To take another extreme example, if you're given a visa, you're Canadian, you're given a visa for 5 years, you could wait until the end of that 5-year period, seek entry on the last day, and get 2 years of status. Now, again, that's an extreme example. The government official at the border might not like that. They might not grant that to you, but legally, you are able to do that. In that example, I use it just to show the difference between visa validity and a period of stay, a status, lawful status. How much investment is enough? This is probably the most common question we get, and I actually see that we've already received that question in the Q&A box of this webinar. The amount of investment that's required depends on the type of business. The government does not say that a certain amount is sufficient, as they do, for example, in the EB-5 green card context. In that context, they will give you a specific dollar amount, and once you've hit that amount, you qualify. That is not how the E-2 is. The E-2, the government wants to see what they call a substantial amount of investment. And to give you an example, starting a law firm, a substantial amount might be only $50,000 because that is enough to get the business operational. If you are starting a business that is going to manufacture car batteries for electric vehicles, you're going to need a lot more than $50,000. The government will want to see that you've probably invested at least several hundred thousand, if not well over $1 million into that enterprise. But what you're trying to show the government is that you've invested enough into the business to show two things. The first is that the business is ready to become operational when you get the visa. And the second is that you are serious about the business. The government uses that investment amount to kind of test how serious the applicant is about the business. Now, the government does have something called the proportionality test. And what that means is typically the more money it takes to start the business, the lower the percentage of that amount the government will expect to see actually spent. So to go back to our example, if you're starting a law firm with a $50,000 investment amount, to get the business started, the government will want to see all of that spent. If you're starting an electric vehicle battery manufacturing business that requires $10 million to start, the government might be okay seeing only $7 million invested into that business. So 70%, for example. So that's what the proportionality test is. Given that this presentation is about risky and low investment cases, almost across the board, you're going to want to invest 100%. Or at least very close to 100% of what the business needs to get started. If you're buying a business, typically the fair market value of the business is sufficient. So if the business is being marketed at $100,000 or at $80,000 and it's on sale to the public, and that's what you pay, usually that is fine. That will meet the substantial investment requirement. Now, again, you do want to buy a business that is employing people, make sure it's a robust business. If you're buying a business from a family member, do make sure that you're paying the fair market value. You could run into trouble, for example, if a family member is selling you their convenience store and they're giving you a significant discount on it, the government might say you have not invested a substantial amount. So you do want to make sure you're paying the fair market value for that business. So how do you deal with a low dollar amount? If your investment is low, say you're starting a consulting firm or a law firm or any other type of business, and you have spent $50,000 and you just can't figure out how to spend more, what do you do? The first thing, let me say, when we refer to risky cases, I think we would always consider a risk to be present if the investment amount is under 100,000. Now, there are definitely viable applications with an investment amount under 100,000, but when a client comes to us and says, I have $100,000, we would start to think about, okay, how do we make sure this application is strong, given that they're not investing more? So if you are investing $50,000, that would certainly be considered a risky application. We would recommend a few things. If you really have spent everything that the business needs, you've spent on marketing, you have an office space, you have independent contractors, everything is lined up. We would say, is there an opportunity for you to transfer more funds to the business bank account as working capital? So working capital, I said before, it's not enough to just transfer funds to the business bank account. That is true if that's all you have. If you have $10 million and all you've done is transferred it to a business bank account, you're going to be denied because you need to commit the funds. But if you only have $50,000 and you've spent $30,000 of that, you could put the remaining $20,000 into the business bank account to say, this is working capital. I will use it on the business. It will be committed to the future operations and expansion of the business. And that could be persuasive. So see if you can put working capital in the business bank account. The second thing I would say is really think about the overall strength of the application. Even if you have a low investment amount, it can be very persuasive if you already are employing a worker, a US worker. So see if you can hire someone as an office assistant, even an independent contractor to help you with your website or your marketing. That could be very persuasive in an application to show that even though you've invested a low amount, your business really is at a state where you do need outside support. So you will be employing US workers. So that, again, I said before, the employment piece can make or break an application. This is an example where it really can make an application. If you've invested a low amount, but you're showing, I already need workers, then the government has less of a question about that and a higher likelihood of approving. You can also show evidence that the business really is real and operating. So include contracts from people, include letters of interest, that there really are people out there who do want to buy your products or services. Even though you have a low investment amount, you're already creating something that the public wants to buy. That can be very persuasive. And finally, have a very strong business plan. So the business plan really can, even though right now you might not have a lot of money to invest, you might not be employing many or any employees, have a strong business plan in the application that shows that over the next few years, you really will be in a position to generate increased revenue, employ workers while paying yourself. And outline how you're going to get there. What are you going to sell? Who are you going to sell to? How much are you going to sell so that you will need workers and you will have sufficient funds to pay those workers? That really can, a business plan, we would say, is critical if you have a risky application. And you see a couple examples on your screen. These are really just going to show that it does help you as an applicant with a risky application to be willing and able to think creatively about how to strengthen your application and to put money on the line to do that, even if it means hiring someone before you really do need someone to work for you. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this. Common E-2 visa expenditures are those that the company needs to operate: marketing, legal fees, any licenses, etc., inventory. Think about, you're the expert on the business, so think about what the business needs to operate. And bad expenditures are just those that really are not needed by the business. So your travel to the US, spending on meals or entertaining prospective employees, recruiting people or meeting with business associates. Those are relatively weak expenses. We can talk through that. If you have questions, a consultation could be helpful. So at this point, I will pass it off to Ian to talk about common challenges for consulting businesses.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dustin. It's great to be here. And as Dustin mentioned, the the firm was founded on an E-2 visa, and so some of these very same challenges are challenges that I saw myself because legal services are just a form of consulting services. So I think that Dustin did a great job going through the low investment amount, and I think that it's one of the problems I think that people find it very difficult to wrap their heads around is that we all know that you could spend money on a computer and a desk and a chair and work from home and maybe spend $5,000 or $6,000, and that would be enough to start a consulting business. And while we all know that, and even though there are articles that support that that suggest that you need very little, a consulate is going to require that you spend more. And a good example for me is when I started my business, I entered into a irrevocable lease for a year that I was paying $1,700 for a closed door office, and I didn't need the office, right? So $20,000 later, my first year, I barely had any clients, and I was perfectly comfortable working at home, but I did unfortunately have to spend money that I maybe would not have otherwise spent, right? Because it's a bit counterintuitive. You're starting a new business and you want to be frugal and cost conscious, et cetera. But unfortunately, to get the E-2 visa, there is a requirement that you spend that you spend money. And along with that, there's kind of this idea of they're not going to approve a visa if you just have the intent to start a business, right? So they really want to see that you've spent money in all of the different areas, and that that you actually have put the money on the line. And the problem is you're doing it before you get the visa, right? Because if you go to the consulate and then don't get the visa, then there's you have this business and you have all of this money spent, and you have to deal with that. But that being said, keep in mind that the overwhelming number of E-2 visas are approved. So our approval rate is 98 or 99%. Our past results do not predict future outcome, but even the government posted approval rate for E-2 visas over 80%. So that includes people who don't know, are applying on their own, maybe lawyers who don't quite do E-2s that submit applications, and also individuals that submit them, and taking into account some consular posts that are extremely difficult, because there's some places where it's very, very difficult to get an E-2 even with a higher investment amount. But when you're looking at a consulting business in particular, do try to put yourself in the consular's officer's shoes. We had one individual who was applying in Toronto, and he was applying under he was going to be a management consultant. It was a consulting business, and he was going to be a management consultant. And when he got to the window, the person asked, "Tell me about your business," and the person, kind of gave a deer in headlight look and froze. And that was enough for the consular officer to deny their application, because they thought, if you can't make a sales pitch to me, then how are you going to make it to other people to obtain business? So that wasn't something that is going to be positive for that particular application. Dustin went over a lot of the different expenditures, but it is good to keep in mind that there are good expenditures and bad ones that like even though we include legal fees in the expenditures for an E-2 visa, that's certainly not as good as office space, office equipment, investing in marketing, or staffing costs. Those are all much better expenditures. And then it can even get worse if you start to include the expenditures that Dustin had identified under the bad list. And I think that the thing is here is sometimes you can lose credibility, right? If you include expenditures that really aren't really valid to the business. Another one that sometimes comes up, in particular, as we're talking about a consulting business, is an individual who wants to include a car, right? So, the consulting business, that's really not needed, right? Even the IRS has big issues with people including or writing off expenses related to cars, because they think that the car, for the most part, is personal. There are some E-2 visa applications where a vehicle is very relevant, But for consulting business, it's probably not, right? So especially these days, where most things can be done remotely. So the next type of risky case that we're going to talk about has to do with real estate investing. And now, so this could cover a number of different types of businesses. Some of them are listed at the bottom of the slide. But I think that one of the reasons that this can become challenging is because the government officials, the adjudicators, often will default to the real estate aspect or part of the business as being passive. So sometimes you get individuals who maybe buy a property and then say that they're going to renovate it and flip it, and then they want an E-2 visa. And that can be very difficult because one could argue that you don't need a visa for that. If you were in the United States or outside of the United States, you could buy the property and do exactly that, and it would be very passive, the same way you could buy a stock in the stock market and sell it and make some money, and that certainly wouldn't be a business. But I think that the time when it does become a business, using that exact example, is when the number of properties that one has is significant. So we did an E-2 visa for one client, for example, and they had over 50 properties, and that makes it for a good E-2 visa, because then you can argue that it really is a business. They're going to need a property management company. They're going to need someone to collect the rent, to do maintenance on the properties, et cetera, because they were doing a number of different things: fixing, flipping, renting, all sorts of different things. So so that that like really you want to, because the whole idea with an E-2 visa is you want to be able to show that the business is not just a passive, what you're doing or your endeavor is not just something passive, but that it actually is a business, right? So that a business that where you're able to hire US workers, because that's an E-2 is all about, that is hiring US workers. But there is potential to get an E-2 for, a number of areas or a number of types of businesses that are related to real estate. We've done E-2 visas for all of the businesses listed on this slide, where you have real estate brokerage firms. So someone's, in essence, a real estate agent, the property management companies, we've done, and also renovation companies. And I think that what's important with, kind of what's important is how you position your file as well, because sometimes an individual might want to buy houses and flip them, but sometimes that file can be positioned as a home renovation business. And that's beneficial for a few reasons. One, it may not kind of be burdened by the passive nature that I just discussed. But the other reason is that the government is going to, the government is going to take a look at that, and they're actually going to quickly be able to see that the that particular type of business, can actually hire U.S. workers, and then because whether it's electricians, plumbers, people who are going to be doing the work with respect to restoring the house. But then the other piece I think that's important is that when you do like a house flipping business, then your inventory is the homes, right? So in order to sell it, you kind of you do have, your investment amount is going to be quite significant, because you would have to have an inventory of homes. And as Dustin had mentioned, that sometimes there is an issue with including in your investment amount any type of seller financing. So if the home has seller financing and or mortgage, so if the home does have a mortgage associated with it, and the security is the actual property, which all mortgages, that's the way they work, then you could have a problem proving that you've invested a substantial amount. So that's something to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, house flipping, it can work, and we have had a couple of clients where we've done that, but in each of those cases, the client has had a number of properties. So the other type of business that can be difficult or risky are businesses associated with equity trading. Oh, and just one last thing to comment on with the real estate is that one thing that we definitely notice with real estate investing is that the consulates and USCIS, if you're applying through USCIS, often are a bit more focused on having whatever type of license is needed. So if you do opt for some type of home renovation business, it is, I think, important to make sure that you go to the consulate, and especially to USCIS, with whatever license that you is required to run that business. So with equity businesses, They suffer from the same issue that real estate businesses do, in that a consular officer or a USCIS officer may feel that the business is passive. So, because an individual, let's say they have their own money or they're managing their family's money, then they probably, well, certainly if they're managing their own money, they don't need a license to do that. And arguably, if they're managing the family's money, maybe they don't either. And the government might feel that that's a very passive endeavor that doesn't require US workers, right? So, or it would not require US workers. So that it does suffer from that. But that being said, we have done a number of equity businesses, whether they're hedge funds, whether they're trading just trading firms, whether they're cryptocurrency trading firms. So we have done that, and we've done those successfully. And the idea here is, I think, to make these successful, is to make sure that the person who's applying, or the people who are applying, are actually managing other people's money, right? So they're not managing their own money, and they're not managing the family's money. And that's something that can move from the government thinking the investment is very passive to one that actually is a business, because as we all know, investment banks, a lot of them do that, and they are thriving businesses that have lots and lots of employees. So that definitely is important. And then, along with that, they have to have prospects, right? They have to have clients that maybe have already committed to giving the money to manage, et cetera, and that's going to be important. And similarly, with respect to regulation, this particular industry is highly regulated, especially if you're managing other people's money. You have to have the proper licenses in place. So that's going to be very important. And in fact, what a very large expenditure with respect to these types of businesses normally is the expenditures associated with the legal fees of getting not the immigration work, but the company set up to comply with all of the different regulatory requirements, and those are certainly eligible E-2 visa fees. So reasons for denial. So this is an interesting slide, and I'm not going to go in the order that is listed here, because I think that probably the biggest reason for denial has to do with the scenario where someone has an existing business in their home country that is the same business that they plan to open up in the United States, and the existing business does not or has not had or does not have employees, right? That is a very, very bad, very, very bad sign for an officer, because an officer is going to think that, well, they've been running this business in their home country for so long, and they now want to come to the US and do the same thing, and they would just think that you just want to be a sole proprietorship or run your business on your own the same way that you're doing in your home country. So it is something that's, and the big problem with this reason for denial, it's a very, very difficult one to overcome, right? So another reason for denial has to do with like low investment amount. Dustin talked about that at great length, but that's relatively easy one to overcome as long as you have the money to invest, is because if you're denied, you can just invest more money and then go back again and apply. You might at that point also provide a CPA letter that says that you have invested everything that's required to get the business up and running. You've spent more money, and you could reapply. So that's a much easier one to overcome. But where a government feels that you're not going to be able to hire employees, there's not a lot you can do. We had this situation once where an applicant from London, and he actually, before he even applied, because we warned him that this could be a big issue, and even before he applied, he already hired an employee in the United States, but the consulate wasn't, they still didn't feel it was enough, and they didn't approve his application. And that was one of the rare cases that we've had where the person didn't reapply, right? So it's because normally you can't overcome the reason for denial. The other is nature of business, just what we talked about earlier, like if it's a real estate business versus equity business, et cetera. The other is something you have very little control over, unfortunately, is the filing location, where you file. Like, not all consulates are created equal. There are some consulates that are very, very difficult consulates. So that's something unfortunately that it's just not really anything you can have control over, because normally you do apply in the country that you live in. So that's something to keep in mind. But sometimes one of the things you can do in a country that has, that's much more difficult is, you still consider it when you're filing the application. A consulate like London, for example, you may be able to have a lower investment amount if you have other positive factors. But if you're applying at a consulate that's identified that has a history of being very, very difficult to get E-2 visas approved, then you may want to start with a much higher investment amount, or consider a completely different E-2, an E-2 where some consulates don't really love service-oriented businesses. So you might want to consider an E2 where you're buying an existing business and more of a bricks and mortar business or a restaurant or a franchise, do a franchise or something like that. That might be easier to get approved in a consulate that is much more difficult. Similar to the issue that I talked about, the first issue that I talked about, just concern over whether the business will create jobs, because that's the issue, right? If they feel if you haven't created jobs in your home country, you're not going to. Issues with adjudicating officer, this doesn't happen that often, but there's one case I recall where the individual had a very good case, and they actually had been approved through USCIS before, but he didn't want to go to the consulate right away because his kids were in school or whatever. So we went to the consulate a few months later, and he was denied. But when I spoke to him, I realized very quickly that the interview kind of went poorly because the applicant didn't get along that well with the officer, right? So I think deferential policy is probably better in these situations. The officer has the ability to deny a petition without any explanation, and quite frankly, there's nothing you can do about it, right? That's probably the best way to describe what you can do about an E-2 visa denial, right? There's nothing you can do about it, in terms of to change the decision, right? Like you can apply again, right? That's what you can do, which you already have one denial on your record. And then finally, the last is that the individual doesn't meet the requirement at the time of filing. So this could be something extremely obvious, like they're not from a treaty country. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's happened. Lawyers who weren't aware that a country was removed, so it was still showing up on the list, but had an asterisk that said a description at the bottom that said that no new people can't apply, but the lawyer didn't realize, sent the person to the consulate, and they were ineligible because that country is no longer on the list. But then sometimes it can be something a little bit more subtle, where the individual, for example, let's say they purchased a motel that was $1 million and they put down $50,000 and had $950,000 in seller financing, and didn't realize that $950,000 can't be included in the investment amount, so then they don't meet the substantial investment test, right? So it could be a little bit more subtle as well. So in terms of trends, COVID is still lurking in terms of, causing an impact on consular processing, and not nearly as bad as it did. But, we had processing in some consulates that were 2 or 3 weeks that are still months. And then some consulates are just kind of now starting to reopen to E2s, but definitely much better than it was even a year and a half ago. Definitely when you're looking at applying at a consulate, you can get a decent idea of timing. Your lawyer should be able to get a decent idea of timing. They may not know off the top of their head. However, once you become a client, we can often circulate, even if it's a consulate that we don't file in that often, we can certainly circulate in a group of lawyers who one of which or many of which may have processed in that consulate to get an idea. We still see a lot of, because there are still timing delays, we do see kind of more USCIS filings than before COVID. There's very little reason to do a USCIS filing, given that it's not a visa, it's just a change of status. There are limited scenarios when a USCIS petition is better than a consular processing, but those are very limited scenarios, and there are you definitely want to speak to your immigration lawyer to see if one of those scenarios apply to you. But often it's better to go to a consulate. Some just some questions that often come up with respect to E-2 visas that are interesting. Do you have to hire employees before you apply for an E-2 visa? No. The answer is no. We have the majority of the E-2s that we do are for startups, and probably 80% of those don't have employees on day one. You do have to, as Dustin mentioned, you have to include a business plan for a startup that shows that you plan to hire employees over a period of time. Over a 5-year period, you want to at least have the equivalent of 3 full-time employees, but they don't have to be on day one. Source of funds, there is a requirement that you show the government where the money came from. And this is a requirement that is interesting because it is popping up more at consulates lately, where we're seeing even consulates that really glossed over source of funds in the past are now asking, when we send in the file, then they're coming back to us and asking more about the source of funds. So but if you're doing a USCIS filing, then it really is more of an audit that is done, right? So you do have to show the money, trace the money, and show where it came from. Loans are fine. All loans are fine except for loans that are secured by the assets of the entity. I know Dustin talked about that already. Then gifts are also fine, but whether it's a loan or gift, you have to show where the loan proceeds came from, or if it's a gift, then you have to show where the gift proceeds came from. Certainly, E-2 visas for 2 investors is fine. You can do 50-50 ownership, and both can get an E-2 visa. And then both, if they're from the same country, then the business is going to be from that country. But if they're from different countries, then you do have eligibility to bring in E-2 employees from both countries. If you do, let's say you have a consulting business and you say, I don't like this anymore, I want to do something else. And then you want to, say, for example, open up a restaurant. That's possible, but you have to go through a procedure. You have to either do an amendment within the United States and or go back to the consulate. So just something to keep in mind. Similarly, if you change ownership, and generally here we're speaking about changing ownership such that as Dustin mentioned, the E-2, the country, if in order to have an E-2 visa, the business has to be at least 50% owned by nationals of the E-2 treaty country, right? So that's something you always have to monitor and keep in mind. There's an obscure concept called operational control that we don't really like to rely on. It means you have less than 50% ownership, but then operationally you control, but we don't really like to rely on it. And you can count on a consulate not liking it. So it's and then the last thing on this slide is related to, we do have a lot of cases where people are buying a business and then they're buying it from a brother, sister-in-law, that type of thing. And those come under a significant amount of scrutiny because the government is worried often that, not much is actually really going on. So that's something you have to really keep in mind.
Great, thank you, Ian. So we've received a number of excellent questions. A few of them are about, is my investment amount enough? I would say go back a few slides, watch the recording. Basically, we can't say based on a dollar amount whether the investment amount is enough. It depends on the type of business. It depends on whether you're doing things like hiring an employee beforehand, strengthening the application holistically. But if you'd like to discuss your investment amount, do reach out, schedule a consultation. We would be happy to have that discussion. This question, as an established consulting business that's never had an employee, how critical is it to have an employee prior to filing or even hiring independent contractors? It's quite critical. Excuse me. So the government is going to look at your track record. And if you have a business that's been around for 3, 5, 10 years and has never employed a worker, you're going to have to explain to them what you're going to do differently to employ workers. And it's easier to make that explanation and convince the government if you've hired a worker before you apply. So it is a material difference that would strengthen the application. Does our firm help to create the company? We do. We form LLCs. That is an additional service we do provide. Please do reach out to us if you're interested. Excuse me, just going down the list. We have some great questions, a lot of them. And Ian, I'm going to pass a couple to you in a moment, but I think there are a few that we can get through. Is it better to buy an existing business compared to a franchise? Impossible to answer on the face of it. It all depends on the strength of the existing business. If the existing business has 20 employees and you're buying half of it, that is a very strong application likely. If the franchise is a weak franchise that doesn't have a track record, probably weaker. But if the franchise is a Subway sandwiches and high investment amount, very likely to employ people, you have a strong application. So all depends on the details. Feel free to reach out to us for more information. Let's see. Can the business that I start be different from my background? So as an example, my background's in banking. I want to start a pool cleaning service. That can certainly be a viable application. Again, the government is not looking for someone who spent their career in pool cleaning. What they're looking for is someone that is qualified to run a pool cleaning business. So what does that take? Well, you're going to be managing, you're going to be budgeting, you're going to be making decisions about developing and directing the business. So look to your background, your resume, the cover letter, the business plan. These would all emphasize how your experience in the banking industry equip you to actually run a pool cleaning business. But frankly, I wouldn't be too concerned about that. We see people change industries quite frequently. I love this next question. It's a great question. A dual citizen, someone who's a national of Canada and the UK, gets an E-2 visa. Can they hire both Canadian or UK nationals? The answer is no. When you apply for an E-2 visa, you need to choose your nationality. You're only going to have the E-2 visa in one passport. It's either going to be your UK passport or your Canadian passport. And that's the nationality of your company. The only way to have a company that has dual nationality is for there to be a 50-50 split in ownership, and for one investor, E-2 investor, to be from one E-2 treaty country and the other investor to be from another E-2 treaty country. Great question, though. I'm from the UK. I have ESTA. Can I come to the US, secure the business, and file for an E-2 while in the US? The answer is no, you cannot change status while you're on ESTA in the US. If you want to do this, though, you could get a B1 visa, a B1 business visitor visa. That could be a great option to come to the US, meet with a business broker, meet with potential business partners, and actually open a business bank account, things like that. A B1 does not allow you to work, so be very careful not to perform unauthorized work. But you can set up a business and take steps to set that business up while you're on a B1. Does the amount of E-2 visa vary from one US state to another? No, it is across the United States. So, Ian, a few questions that I am going to ask you to chime in on. One, we have long webinars on specifically this question. In fact, I think we did one yesterday. Or the day before, Ian. Going from E-2 to a green card, how much time does it take?
Yep. Yeah. So I would just refer, like it's unfortunately just kind of beyond the scope of this webinar, because there are multiple different green card categories that you could move to an E-2 move from an E-2 to a green card. But we do have another webinar, as Dustin and I did it just the other day. You can go on our YouTube channel and take a look at it. And the title of that webinar is moving from I can't remember if it's a visa to a green card or E-2 to a green card, but it doesn't matter. Either of them would answer your question, and they're both 45 minutes, right? So unfortunately we don't have that time right now to go through it. Yeah,
absolutely. And this next question, very interesting. I have a child who's over 16 who wants to work part-time in my E-2 business. Can they do a change of status to an E-2 employee visa?
I doubt it. The E-2 employee visa is going to require, they'd have to be either a manager or executive, and it'd be very manager, executive, or specialist, and it's unlikely they'd get approved given their age and experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. That being said, if the child is an adult and has some relevant experience, maybe they've worked in the business, since they were 16, they got a degree, specialized in it, have the certifications, that could be a viable E-2 employee application. So Ian, this question is regarding what you discussed about the change of status from within the US. First question is, how long is it taking to get an answer from USCIS for a change of status? I just took a look. USCIS is estimating 1 to 2 months for a change of status if you do not choose premium processing. If you choose premium processing, could be as short as 2 weeks for that change of status. Um, the next question, Ian, is should the business be operating while I'm in the US and USCIS is deciding my change of status application?
It can, but you just can't work there. So that's maybe the short answer to the question. Yeah.
So hire someone. Great way
Exactly.
to avoid unauthorized work and actually strengthen your application. We only have 1 minute left. You can move the state that your business is in general.
Mhm.
Um, okay. How do we show ties to our home country? You would include proof of a bank statement in your home country if you have a mortgage, any family ties. Those are examples. We have blog posts on that question. Um,
And just very quickly on that question is normally you don't have to for an E2. You can just submit a statement that says that you plan to return to your home country.
yes, exactly. And the percentage in investment required for low cost is higher. That's the proportionality test that I was talking about. So if your business takes $100,000 to start, you have to invest 100%. If your business requires 10 million to start, you might get away with investing 70% of that amount. That's
Mhm.
all the proportionality test is saying. Um, okay, we are at time. We have questions continuing to roll in. I'm going to quickly get through these and then encourage anyone with remaining questions to reach out for a consultation. So I think there's confusion. The proportionality test is not percentage ownership, it's percentage investment. So you always have to own at least 50% of the business. The investment is if it costs $10 million, you may need to invest only 70 to 80%. So hopefully that clarifies that. You always need at least 50% ownership to qualify for the visa. As a Canadian, can I establish an LLC in the US, work on developing it in California, stay in the US? Okay, you're going to have to be very careful about unauthorized work. That's what Ian talked about before. You can hire someone to do that while you're in the US. The process of an E2 startup acquiring an existing US business, that sounds a bit nuanced. If the business is taking over another one, why don't you schedule a consultation and we can talk through that? My son is 20 years old, US born. Can I change my status next year from E2 to green card? Expanding into the green card territory. So we do have presentations on green card and immediate family sponsorship. So watch that webinar and reach out to us if we can be helpful. Excellent questions, very active audience. We do thank you for that. Ian, thank you for taking the
Thank you very much.
time. Please do keep an eye out for an email, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you.